I was sitting in the car, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles went white. The cold glow from the screen illuminated the 2 dots on the map. One was me, parked in a shadowy corner of Maple Avenue, and the other was Linda. My wife. Her dot wasn't moving alone, another dot was practically fused with hers, Brian. Her coworker. The guy she'd sworn up and down was just a friend. Next to me in the passenger seat, Allison, Brian's wife, stared at the same screen. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set with the kind of determination that only comes from a heart repeatedly stomped on. Her voice was quiet but sharp. "Looks like our cheaters have taken the bait and are having fun at your house right now." Our house. The home Linda and I built together over 8 years. The place where we argued over wallpaper colors, hosted barbecues, and whispered plans for our future under tangled sheets. Now it was nothing but a stage for their pathetic little performance. "Well," I said, forcing the word out through clenched teeth, "let's go and finally catch them in the act." The plan wasn't complicated. Allison had come to me 2 weeks ago after finding flirty texts between Linda and Brian. Her hands had shaken as she held out her husband's phone, showing me every emoji-laden message, every half-hearted excuse disguised as professionalism. From there, we decided to bait them, fake an emergency meeting that would force them to sneak off. But tonight, instead of following the trap, they'd gone straight to the comfort of my home. I turned the ignition, and the engine growled to life. Allison stared straight ahead as I pulled out of the lot, her lips pressed into a thin line. The silence between us was loud, filled with unspoken words, shared humiliation, and festering anger. Every stoplight felt like an insult. Every second felt like another opportunity for Linda and Brian to deepen the knife wound in my chest. My heart was racing, and my palms were slick with sweat, but I couldn't let my emotions get the better of me, not yet. As we turned onto my street, the sight of Brian's sleek silver SUV parked shamelessly in my driveway nearly pushed me over the edge. They didn't even bother hiding. No sneaking around. No discretion. Just raw arrogance. Allison let out a shaky breath beside me. "They really don't care, do they?" "No," I said flatly. "They don't." I killed the engine and stepped out of the car, the chill of the night air biting at my face. Allison followed, clutching her phone tightly in her hand. The glow from my living room window spilled out onto the lawn, and I could hear faint laughter, Linda's laugh. The same laugh that used to make my chest feel warm now felt like acid poured into an open wound. I didn't knock. Didn't hesitate. I pushed the front door open, and it swung inward with a sharp creak. "Linda!" I barked, my voice echoing through the entryway. The laughter stopped. As I stepped into the living room, my breath caught in my throat. There she was, Linda, lounging on my couch, her blouse slightly unbuttoned, a glass of wine in her hand. Next to her, Brian sat with his arm draped casually across the back of the couch, wearing a smug grin like he owned the place. The shock on their faces when they saw me standing there was almost satisfying. Almost. "Jake," Linda stammered, her voice high-pitched and nervous. What are you doing here?" I stepped further into the room, every movement controlled, every word sharp. "I should be asking you that, Linda. But I think the answer's obvious." Brian sat up straighter, his smirk faltering as Allison stepped out from behind me. "Allison," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Surprised to see me, Brian?" she hissed. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Just 4 people in a room heavy with betrayal, anger, and the stench of cheap lies. Linda's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but there was none. "Jake, it's not what it looks like." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like, Linda. You're sitting here, in our home, with him." Brian stood up, his hands raised slightly. "Look, this is getting blown out of proportion. We're just. Don't. Speak, Allison snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Linda tried again, her voice trembling now. Jake, please, we can talk about this. This doesn't have to. No, I interrupted. We're done talking. The tension in the air was unbearable. Linda's face was pale, her makeup smudged slightly under her eyes. Brian had gone quiet, his bravado completely drained. Allison's voice broke through the silence, low and venomous. Do you two have any idea what you've done? The lies, the sneaking around, the complete disregard for anyone but yourselves? Did you think you'd get away with it forever? Neither of them answered. The silence stretched, and in that stillness, something in me shifted. This wasn't just a messy confrontation anymore. This was war. And I wasn't walking away quietly. For a long moment, none of us moved. The silence in my living room was heavier than lead, pressing down on every inch of me. My wife, my Linda, stood there like a deer in headlights, her wine glass still clutched in her manicured hand. Brian shifted uncomfortably, his confidence gone, his shoulders hunched like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Allison's voice broke the silence, slicing through the tension like a razor blade. Say something, Linda. Anything. Linda glanced at me, her brown eyes wide and watery, her lips trembling as if she were some sort of victim here. Jake. No, I cut her off sharply, my voice low and cold. No excuses. No lies. You don't get to play the victim right now. Her mouth snapped shut. Good. For once, she was speechless. Brian, of course, decided this was his moment to step in. His voice was unsteady, but he still tried to sound reasonable, as if reason had a place here. Look, man, this isn't what it looks like. I turned to him slowly, staring him dead in the eyes. You're sitting on my couch. In my house. With my wife. So tell me, Brian, what exactly does this look like to you? Because to me, it looks like betrayal. It looks like two selfish cowards who thought they could do whatever they wanted without facing any consequences. Brian opened his mouth again, but Allison stepped forward before he could speak. You don't get to talk, Brian. You don't get to justify this or smooth it over. You're pathetic. Brian visibly deflated under her glare, sinking back onto the couch like a scolded dog. Linda's voice cracked as she spoke again. Jake, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to. You didn't mean for it to happen. I repeated bitterly. That's your excuse? You accidentally invited him into our house? You accidentally unbuttoned your blouse? You accidentally let this go on for God knows how long? Her lip quivered, and she looked away, staring down at her feet. You could have told me, Linda, I continued, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. You could have come to me. Said you were unhappy. Said something. But instead, you did this. Behind my back. In our home. For a moment, Linda looked like she might argue back, like she might throw some half-baked excuse my way. But she didn't. She stayed silent, clutching that damn wine glass like it was a lifeline. Allison let out a bitter laugh. You know what's funny, Linda? You always seemed so put together. So perfect. But here you are, exposed. A liar. A fraud. Linda flinched at the words, and for a second, I thought she might drop the glass. Brian muttered something under his breath, something like, "This is getting out of hand," but none of us paid him any attention. I took a deep breath, my chest rising and falling as I tried to steady myself. My hands were shaking with the kind of anger that burns low and cold, the kind that doesn't fade with time. How long? I asked, my voice low. Linda looked up at me, her eyes filled with guilt and something else, fear, maybe. How? Long. She hesitated. 6 months. The words hit me harder than I expected. 6 months. Half a year. Half a year of lies. Half a year of pretending. Half a year of letting me believe we were still us. Allison let out a sharp breath beside me, and I could see her hands trembling as she stared at Brian. 6 months. That's how long you've been spitting on our marriage. Brian tried to say something, but his voice faltered, and he fell silent again. My gaze was fixed on Linda. Do you love him? Her mouth opened, then closed. The hesitation said more than words ever could. I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound, it was sharp, bitter, broken. That's all I needed to know. I turned to leave. Allison hesitated, glancing at me as if waiting for direction. But Linda wasn't done. She dropped the wine glass, it hit the carpet with a soft thud, spilling red wine across the beige fabric, and she ran forward, grabbing my arm. Jake, please. Don't go. We can fix this. I made a mistake, but we can work through it. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back into her tear-streaked face. A mistake? I repeated softly. No, Linda. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is burning dinner. What you did? That's not a mistake. That's a choice. A deliberate choice. Over and over again. I pulled my arm free and stepped back. Allison turned to Brian, her voice sharp and cold. Don't come home tonight, Brian. Don't ever come home again. Brian's mouth hung open, but he didn't argue. Linda sank to her knees as I walked to the door, her sobs filling the silence behind me. Outside, the night was cold, and the weight on my chest felt unbearable. Allison followed me out, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold herself together. We stood by my car, both of us staring at nothing. What now? Allison asked softly. I didn't have an answer. But one thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. The night air bit into my skin as I leaned against the side of my car. Allison stood a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself, staring blankly at the pavement. Neither of us spoke for what felt like hours. The muffled sound of Linda's sobs still carried faintly from inside the house, but I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. Allison broke the silence first. Jake, what do we do now? Her voice was fragile, like glass about to shatter. I ran a hand through my hair, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving behind a cold emptiness. I don't know, Allison. I really don't. She nodded slowly, biting her lower lip as tears welled in her eyes. But she didn't cry. She just stood there, holding herself together with sheer force of will. We can't stay here, I said finally, my voice low and rough. I can't stand here, listening to her cry and pretend she's sorry. Where do we go? She asked. I shrugged. Anywhere but here. We climbed into my car, the silence inside somehow louder than the one outside. I started the engine and pulled away from the house, watching it shrink in the rearview mirror until it was gone entirely. For a while, we just drove. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the faint crackle of the radio playing some late-night jazz station. I had no destination in mind, just the need to keep moving, to put distance between myself and the wreckage of my marriage. After about 20 minutes, I pulled into an all-night diner on the edge of town. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as we stepped inside, the smell of burnt coffee and stale grease wrapping around us. A tired-looking waitress greeted us with a half-hearted smile and motioned toward a booth by the window. We sat down across from each other. Allison stared at the cracked vinyl tabletop, her fingers tracing an invisible pattern. I flagged down the waitress and ordered 2 coffees. Black. Strong. When the mugs arrived, Allison wrapped her hands around hers like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Jake," she started softly, her voice trembling. "How did we miss it? How did we not see this coming?" I sighed, staring down into my coffee. "Because we trusted them. Because we wanted to believe in them." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I keep replaying every moment in my head. Every stupid little excuse Brian gave me. Every time he was late coming home. Every time he said he had to work late. And I believed him." I looked up at her, and for a moment, all the anger drained away, replaced by a shared sadness, a bond forged in betrayal. We wanted to believe them because the alternative was too painful to face. But here we are, Allison. Face to face with it. She wiped a tear away with the back of her hand, her voice cracking. "I feel like such an idiot." "You're not an idiot," I said firmly. "Neither of us are. They're the ones who did this. They're the ones who made the choice." The silence settled between us again as we both stared out the window. Outside, the neon sign flickered, casting a faint red glow across the parking lot. "You know what hurts the most?" Allison said softly. "It's not even the physical part. It's the lies. The months of lying right to my face. Making me feel crazy when I started to suspect something." I nodded, my stomach twisting at the memory of Linda's sweet, innocent voice saying, "You're being paranoid, Jake. Brian's just a friend." A fresh wave of anger surged through me, and I gripped my coffee mug tightly. "They didn't just cheat on us, Allison. They made us doubt ourselves. They made us question our own instincts." She met my eyes then, her voice steady despite the tears pooling in her eyes. "Do you think they ever felt guilty? Even for a second?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't know. But I do know one thing, they didn't care enough to stop." The waitress came by, refilled our mugs, and asked if we wanted anything else. We both shook our heads, and she walked away, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. Allison stared into her coffee, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now, Jake? Do we just go back to our broken homes and pretend to pick up the pieces? How do you even start over after something like this?" I leaned back in the booth, letting out a long, shaky breath. "I don't have an answer for that, Allison. But I do know one thing, I'm not going back to that house tonight. I can't." She nodded slowly, her voice trembling. "Me neither." We sat there in silence, two strangers bound together by heartbreak and betrayal, sharing a moment of fragile understanding. Finally, Allison spoke again, her voice stronger this time. "Jake, we can't let them walk away from this without consequences. They don't get to just wipe their hands clean and move on while we sit here drowning in the mess they made." I looked at her, and for the first time that night, a small spark of clarity ignited in my chest. "You're right," I said, my voice steady. "They don't get to walk away from this. Not without paying the price." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain, we weren't done yet. The diner clock ticked past 2 a.m., the place now nearly empty except for a trucker nursing a stack of pancakes and a couple of teenagers scrolling through their phones in the corner booth. Allison stared at me across the table, her eyes glinting with something sharp, determination mixed with raw, unfiltered anger. "We can't just sit here," she said, her voice low but firm. "We can't let them get away with this, Jake." I nodded, my grip tightening around the mug. "You're right. But revenge for the sake of revenge, it's messy. We need to be smart about this." Allison leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we turn their own game against them? They think they've gotten away with it, they think we're just going to cry, yell, and eventually forgive them. But what if we bait them?" The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. A plan started to form, piece by piece. You mean, set them up? Give them enough rope to hang themselves? She smirked, and for the first time that night, I saw a flicker of dark amusement on her face. Exactly. They want to play dirty? Let's show them just how dirty we can play. We spent the next hour in hushed tones, outlining every detail. Texts would be sent. Locations would be shared. A trap would be laid. And Linda and Brian would walk right into it. 3 days later. The plan was in motion. Linda had been walking on eggshells since that night, throwing out weak apologies and crocodile tears every chance she got. I played my part, cold, distant, but just forgiving enough to keep her off guard. Allison played her role perfectly too. She had convinced Brian that she wanted to talk things out and try to fix their marriage. The fool took the bait without hesitation. Tonight was the night. Allison had told Brian she'd be out of town visiting her sister. I told Linda I'd be working late at the office. Both of them had swallowed the lies without a second thought. Now, I was parked a block away from Brian and Allison's house, my phone lighting up with a message from Allison. Allison, they're here. They just went inside. I took a deep breath and stepped out of my car. My heart pounded in my chest, my palms slick with sweat. Allison pulled up behind me a few seconds later, her face set in stone. Are you ready for this? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm in her eyes. More than ready, I said. We walked up to the front door. The house was dark except for a faint glow coming from the living room window. Allison reached into her purse and pulled out a key. They don't know I kept a spare, she said with a smirk before unlocking the door. The two of us stepped inside silently. The sound of faint laughter floated down the hallway from the living room. Linda's laugh. That same laugh I used to love. Allison gave me a nod, and we stepped into the living room. And there they were. Linda was perched on the edge of the couch in one of my old college t-shirts, her legs curled under her. Brian sat beside her, shirt unbuttoned, his hand resting on her thigh. They froze when they saw us, eyes wide like a pair of cornered animals. Well, Allison said, her voice dripping with venom. Look what we have here. Linda shot to her feet, her face pale. Jake. Allison, what are you doing here? Brian stood as well, his hands raised slightly, like we were pointing guns at him. I took a step forward, my voice low and sharp. Don't even try it, Brian. We've heard every lie you two could possibly come up with. Linda started stammering, her words a jumbled mess. Jake, please, I thought you said you were at work. You thought wrong, Linda, I snapped. And honestly? I'm glad. Because now, we can get this over with. But before anyone could respond, something unexpected happened. From somewhere upstairs, a thud echoed through the house. Then, footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. All four of us froze. Who else is here? Allison whispered, her voice tight. Linda's eyes went wide with panic, and Brian's face turned pale. What the hell is going on, Linda? Before she could answer, a man's voice came from the top of the stairs. Linda? Who are these people? I turned my head slowly, my blood running cold. A man stepped into view at the top of the stairs, wearing nothing but a towel around his waist. He was tall, muscular, and definitely not Brian. What the hell? Brian muttered, his face a mix of anger and confusion. Linda's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes darting back and forth between the three men in front of her. You've got to be kidding me, Allison said, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. The man on the stairs scratched his head, looking down at the chaos below. Should I come back later? Brian turned to Linda, his voice rising. You said it was just me. You said there was no one else. Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I couldn't help it, I started laughing. A raw, bitter, almost hysterical laugh that filled the silence. Allison joined in a second later. Oh my God, Linda, I said between breaths. You're not just a cheater, you're a serial cheater. The man on the stairs, clearly realizing he'd walked into something far worse than he expected, backed up slowly and disappeared into a bedroom. Brian stormed out the front door without another word, slamming it behind him. Linda sank to her knees, her hands pressed against her face, sobbing uncontrollably. Allison looked at me, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Well, that was unexpected. I nodded slowly, letting out a long breath. I don't know whether to scream or laugh again. Allison smirked, shaking her head. Looks like Linda's house of cards just came crashing down. And just like that, the night took a turn none of us saw coming. Linda's sobs filled the silence like a dull, unrelenting drumbeat. She was on the floor, her hands clutching her face, as if she could hide from the mess she'd made. The sound of the door slamming behind Brian echoed in my ears, but I couldn't quite process it. There were too many layers to this disaster now. Allison and I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. Neither of us knew what to do next. We'd set the trap, but this was, well, this was beyond what we expected. I glanced at Allison, who was staring at Linda with a mixture of disdain and disbelief. What the hell was that about? Allison shook her head. I don't know. But that wasn't just a mistake anymore, Jake. That was a lifestyle. I had to agree. A man upstairs, another affair, and the lies piling on top of each other like some kind of sick game. My stomach twisted in a knot, my thoughts swirling. I had wanted to hurt Linda, to make her face the consequences of her actions, but I hadn't expected this level of betrayal. Not this, sickness. Linda finally wiped her eyes and looked up at me. Her face was red and puffy, her mascara smudged into black streaks down her cheeks. Jake, please, please, don't do this. I narrowed my eyes, my anger now cold, calculated. Don't do what, Linda? Expose you? Trust you? Her hands fell to her lap, her voice trembling. I was going to tell you. I swear. You were going to tell me? I interrupted, my voice rising. When, Linda? When? After another guy walks out of our bedroom? Or when the other dozen affairs come crawling out from under the rug you've been sweeping them under? Her breath hitched, but she didn't answer. She couldn't. Allison stepped forward, her expression harsh. This isn't a mistake anymore, Linda. It's who you are. It's in your blood. You can't hide from it. Linda looked at her, eyes wide with shock. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to become this person? No, Allison said, her voice steady. But that's what you've chosen. Over and over again. You've chosen lies, betrayal, and manipulation. You've chosen this. I looked at Linda, my mind swirling with disgust and anger. I wanted to scream at her, to make her understand the depth of the damage she'd done. But instead, I felt numb. The weight of what I'd discovered felt suffocating. There was no turning back from this. But just as I opened my mouth to speak again, there was a knock at the door. We all froze. It was late. Too late for anyone but a desperate soul to be knocking on the door. I glanced at Allison, who was staring at me with wide eyes. You expecting someone? She whispered. I shook my head. No one else knows about this, not yet. This wasn't the plan. Another knock, this one louder, more insistent. Linda looked up, her face pale. Don't answer it, she whispered urgently. But it was too late. I walked toward the door, every step heavier than the last. I reached for the handle, glancing back at Linda. "Stay here," I ordered. I opened the door to find another man. But this wasn't just any man. This was someone I knew. Someone I didn't expect to see here. It was Steve, my best friend. My heart skipped a beat. What the hell was he doing here? He stood on the porch, a forced grin plastered across his face. "Hey, man, can we talk?" I stood there in stunned silence, the world around me suddenly tilting. "Steve?" I croaked. "What are you doing here?" He glanced over my shoulder, his eyes narrowing when they landed on Linda, who was still on the floor. "I think you and I need to have a little chat, Jake." I stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me. What the hell is going on? Steve's gaze shifted, looking down at his feet, then back at me. "I wasn't going to say anything, but I think you deserve to know the truth." My stomach twisted. My blood felt like it was freezing in my veins. "What truth?" Steve took a deep breath and then dropped the bombshell. "Linda and we've been sleeping together for the last 2 years, Jake." The world tilted again. My vision blurred. It felt like the ground had fallen out from under me. I could barely breathe. 2 years? I whispered. Steve nodded, his face serious. "I didn't want to hurt you, man. I didn't want to destroy our friendship, but I can't keep lying to you." I staggered backward, my hand gripping the doorframe to steady myself. "What the hell is wrong with you, Steve? Why would you do this to me?" "I don't have a good excuse, man. I don't. But we had something, we had a connection. It's just," he stopped himself, but it was too late. I was already done. I could feel the rage burning inside me. 2 years. You've been lying to me for 2 years, Steve." He looked down, ashamed, but there was no denying it now. He wasn't going to make excuses anymore. I turned away, feeling dizzy. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Steve's voice cracked. "Jake, please. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Sorry was too little, too late. I didn't need to hear anything else. Without another word, I turned and walked back into the house. Linda was still sitting on the floor, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. She knew now. She knew everything. I faced her for the first time, my voice low and dangerous. "You've been playing me for a fool, for years. I can't even look at you anymore." Linda's eyes welled up, and she reached for me, but I stepped back. "Don't touch me. You don't get to touch me anymore." I turned and stormed out the door, slamming it behind me. It was over. There was nothing left to say. The night air hit me like a slap in the face as I stepped outside, my head spinning with the weight of everything that had just come crashing down. My best friend, my wife, my entire world had been built on lies. I could hear Steve's footsteps behind me, his attempts to follow, but I couldn't look at him. I couldn't even stand the idea of being near him. I walked quickly down the street, my mind screaming for clarity, but all I could hear was the echo of my own disbelief. 2 years. 2 years of being made a fool of, 2 years of pretending everything was fine while the people closest to me had been tearing apart everything I thought I knew. Steve caught up with me, his hand brushing my shoulder as he tried to grab my arm. "Jake, please, just let me explain." I shrugged his hand off, turning to face him with a force I didn't know I had left in me. "Explain what, Steve? That you've been sleeping with my wife behind my back while acting like my friend?" His face twisted, guilt and shame written all over it. "I'm sorry. I know I betrayed you, but I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I never wanted it to get this far." "Far?" I spat, my anger flaring up again. "It's already too far, Steve. It's beyond redemption. I'm done with you. I'm done with all of it. The lies, the betrayal. I'm through. I turned on my heel and kept walking, not caring where I was going anymore. My thoughts were a blur, only the need to escape from the world I had once known. But then, as I walked further down the darkened street, I realized something. I wasn't running away from Steve or Linda anymore. I was running from the man I had become. The man who had trusted too much, who had ignored too many red flags. A sudden honk of a car horn broke me from my thoughts. I looked up, barely noticing the black SUV speeding toward me. The headlights blared, almost blinding me in their intensity. The car screeched to a halt in front of me, and the door swung open. I squinted, my mind trying to process the figure that stepped out. It was Allison. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, my heart pounding again. She didn't answer at first. She just looked at me, her expression hard to read. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped toward me. "I told you, Jake," she said, her voice raw. "I told you from the beginning. Don't trust anyone. Don't even trust yourself." Her words hit me like another punch to the gut. I'd trusted her, too. I thought she was different, someone who understood. But now, looking at her standing in front of me, I realized how much I had been fooling myself. "What do you want, Allison?" I asked, my voice low, a bit more broken than I cared to admit. Allison's lips twisted into a grimace. "I need to show you something. Something you're not going to believe." I frowned, stepping back. "What are you talking about?" Her eyes darted toward the car, a fleeting moment of hesitation passing before she spoke again. "Just come with me. You'll want to see this. Trust me." I was about to turn away when something inside me told me to stop. Something told me there was more to this. I knew I should be done. I knew I should walk away, but the need for answers, the urge to finally make sense of everything, pulled me toward the car. "Fine," I muttered. "But if this is another one of your games, I swear." "Just get in the damn car, Jake," she cut me off, her voice strained, impatient. I didn't argue. I climbed into the passenger seat, the engine starting up with a roar. As she drove, the air between us was thick with unspoken tension. Neither of us spoke. The city lights blurred past, and I felt like I was being dragged deeper into a storm I couldn't control. Eventually, Allison pulled into an alleyway, parking the car and turning off the engine. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. "What's going on?" I asked, my impatience growing. "All of this. It's not what you think," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her eyes flickered with something darker, something I couldn't quite place. I looked at her, confused. "What do you mean? What's not what I think?" She took a deep breath. "You're not the only one who's been played, Jake. Linda and Brian? They're just the tip of the iceberg." My heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" "All of it. The affairs. The lies. It's all been orchestrated," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Linda didn't just cheat on you with Brian. She's been cheating with other people, too. And I know who they are." I sat up straight, my stomach twisting. "Who?" I demanded. Allison reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to me. "This. It's all the proof you need." I tore open the envelope, my hands trembling as I pulled out the pictures. My mind couldn't fully process what I was seeing. There were photos of Linda, yes, photos of her with other men, caught in compromising positions, places I hadn't even known she visited. But then, my eyes landed on one photo in particular. It was a picture of Linda and Steve. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the photo, the realization hitting me with the force of a speeding truck. Allison wasn't just an observer. She had known everything from the beginning. You knew? I whispered, the question barely audible. She looked at me, her face unreadable. I had to make you see, Jake. You couldn't do it alone. I felt my chest tighten, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This was all part of your plan? She nodded. You needed to wake up. To see the truth. I closed my eyes, trying to process everything. Betrayal after betrayal, layer upon layer of deception, and it all came crashing down at once. I had no idea who I could trust anymore. Not even myself. You should go back, Jake, Allison said, her voice softer now. Make the right choice. I took one last look at her, then at the pictures in my hand. The weight of what had just been revealed was more than I could handle. With a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped out into the night. The city was still, but my life was falling apart faster than I could catch it. The cold night air hit my skin like an electric shock as I stepped out of Allison's car, my hand still trembling from the envelope she had given me. The world around me felt muted, like I was walking through some strange, hazy version of my life. Everything had changed. Everything had always been a lie, and now I was standing at the center of a storm, unsure if I could even find the strength to move forward. The pictures in my hand were burning through my fingertips. I wanted to rip them up, destroy them, but something inside me told me to hold on to them, to remember. To remember that I wasn't just some pawn in this sick game. I was the man who had been deceived, the one who deserved to take control of the narrative from here on out. I started walking, my feet moving without any real direction. My mind was racing, but my body felt heavy, like the weight of all the lies and the betrayal was pressing down on me. Every step felt like a small, painful echo of everything I had lost. I could hear the faint hum of city traffic in the distance, the world still going on, oblivious to the wreckage inside me. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't go back to that house. I couldn't face Linda. I couldn't face Steve. I needed to be alone. The street seemed empty at this hour, the occasional car driving by, but no one else was around. I walked for what felt like miles, aimlessly, my mind swirling with anger, confusion, and disbelief. Every time I thought I had a grip on the situation, something new would hit me, another layer of betrayal, another cut to the heart. I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew who my wife was. I was wrong. I was a fool. And then there was Allison. Her role in this, it still didn't make sense. She wasn't some innocent bystander. She had known, and she'd let it all unfold. Part of me wanted to be angry at her, to lash out at her for manipulating me, but then I realized something. She wasn't just some player in this game. She was part of the story, the one who had shown me the truth when no one else would. She had been cold, calculating, and distant, but she had done it for me, for the truth. I stopped in front of a bar, not even realizing I'd walked this far. The neon sign flickered in the night, calling me inside. It wasn't a place I'd usually go, but tonight was different. I needed something, anything, to numb the pain, if only for a moment. I pushed through the door and walked to the bar, sliding onto the stool. The bartender gave me a quick nod, his face tired, but welcoming enough. I didn't care about pleasantries. I needed a drink. What'll it be? The bartender asked, his voice thick with the weight of a long shift. Whiskey, I rasped. My throat was dry, my heart pounding in my chest. He nodded and poured a glass, sliding it toward me. The amber liquid shimmered in the glass like it held the answers to all my questions. I grabbed it, downing the shot in one go, feeling the burn as it slid down my throat. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the sensation of the alcohol hitting my bloodstream, trying to block out everything else. But it didn't work. The images of Linda and Steve flashed in my mind, the memories of us together, of our supposed happy life. All of it was a lie. I could hear her voice in my head, her words swirling around like a sickening chant. I love you, Jake. You're the only one for me. I slammed my fist on the bar, the sound sharp and sudden. The bartender looked up, startled, but I didn't care. I'm done, I muttered to no one in particular. I'm done being a fool. I'm done being a victim. I looked up at the bartender, my eyes meeting his tired gaze. Give me another, I said, my voice rough. He didn't hesitate this time, pouring me another shot. But just as I reached for the glass, I froze. A figure walked into the bar, and everything around me seemed to go still. The world narrowed to a single point as I recognized her. Linda. She looked different, like she didn't belong here, like the world she had built for herself had crumbled, too. She was standing by the door, her eyes scanning the room, and then she froze when she saw me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The tension in the air was thick, like something was about to snap. She took a step forward, hesitating for just a moment before she came closer, her heels clicking against the floor. Jake, she said softly, her voice almost fragile. I didn't know where else to go. I stared at her, the anger bubbling up again, but something else started to take hold of me, a strange sense of calm. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me anymore. Not tonight. Didn't know where else to go. I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. Is that your excuse? After everything? She flinched, but she didn't back away. I know I've messed up. I know what I did was wrong, but Jake, please. I can't lose you. Really? I scoffed, leaning forward. Because you've been losing me for years, Linda. I just didn't see it. She opened her mouth, but I raised my hand, stopping her. No more lies. No more excuses. I've had enough. I stood up, my hands clenched at my sides. You made your choice, Linda. And now, so have I. I turned and walked out of the bar, the sound of her calling after me fading into the night. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I knew what I had to do now. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making her feel the same pain I had felt. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity. I was done being a part of her twisted little game. I was done with the lies. The streets were darker now, and my steps echoed in the silence like a final drumbeat before everything changed. My chest was tight, but I felt a strange weight lift with every stride, as if the heaviness of years spent in the fog of deceit was finally being shed. I wasn't just walking away from Linda anymore. I was walking toward something new, toward a life I was going to take back for myself. As I rounded the corner, I spotted a figure in the distance, someone standing by a parked car. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. It was Allison. What the hell was she doing here? I walked toward her, my eyes narrowing. She didn't move, didn't look nervous. She was just waiting for me, like she knew I'd show up. The way she stood there, calm and composed, made something in me snap. I didn't know what she wanted anymore, but it wasn't going to end well. What now? I demanded as I reached her, my voice sharp, raw. What else do you want from me? She smiled faintly, not even flinching at my anger. I didn't want you to leave, Jake. Not like this. I shook my head, clenching my fists. Why? So you could keep playing your games? You think I'm just some pawn in all this? After everything, you still want to control the narrative? Her smile never wavered. You don't get it, do you? I wasn't trying to control anything. I was trying to show you the truth. And now that you know everything, you can make the right choice. Right choice? I scoffed. There's no right choice, Allison. It's over. She took a step toward me, her eyes serious for the first time. Is it, Jake? Or is this just the beginning? I frowned, confused. What are you talking about? The choice you make now will define everything that comes next, she said softly. You think this is the end, but it's not. You can walk away from her, from Steve, from the lies, or you can use this. You can take control of everything, make them pay for what they did to you. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. I'd thought I was done. I'd thought I was walking away from it all. But now, I wasn't so sure. There was a dark, dangerous part of me that was starting to stir. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I had the power to make them pay. The adrenaline surged through me, and for the first time in days, I felt alive. The idea of letting Linda and Steve get away with everything, of them continuing their lies without facing the consequences, made my blood boil. But the part of me that was still holding onto something, some shred of decency, wanted to walk away. I don't know what you want me to do, Allison, I said, my voice strained. I can't just turn this into some revenge story. I'm not like you. She stepped closer, her voice low and enticing. You don't have to be like me. You just have to take back what's yours. I looked into her eyes, and for a moment, I saw something cold and calculating there. But there was also something else, something vulnerable. It was the truth I had been too blind to see. She wasn't trying to control me. She was trying to free me. She was giving me the choice I had been too afraid to make for myself. I clenched my jaw. What do you mean? The truth is, Jake, you're stronger than this. You don't have to let them destroy you. Take the power back. Expose everything. Destroy the people who thought they could ruin you. It's your move. My pulse raced. My hands shook as I thought about it, the idea of pulling the strings, of taking control of my life again. Of making Linda and Steve pay for every moment they had stolen from me. But at the same time, I felt something else stirring deep inside. A voice telling me that revenge wouldn't heal anything. It wouldn't give me peace. It would only drag me deeper into their mess. I took a step back, the weight of the decision bearing down on me. I'm not going to become someone I'm not, I said firmly. I'm not going to ruin myself for the sake of getting even. Allison's expression shifted. She didn't seem disappointed or angry. Just resigned. I thought you might say that, she said quietly. You're right, Jake. Revenge isn't the answer. But you also can't just walk away and let them keep getting away with everything. You have to stand up for yourself. No matter what. I looked at her one last time. I'll do it my way. She nodded. I believe you will. I turned and walked away, each step feeling more sure than the last. The night air felt fresher now, like I was finally breathing again. I had learned my lesson. I had been wrong about so many things, about Linda, about Steve, and even about myself. But I wasn't going to let this define me anymore. I wasn't going to let it break me. And as I walked away from Allison, from the mess I had found myself in, I realized one thing for sure. The road ahead was going to be tough, but it was mine to walk. I wasn't going to let anyone control my future. I had taken back control. And that was the beginning of something new.